From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about counterterrorism policy under the Biden administration. We'll be discussing the new and evolving threats at home and abroad, and what the U.S. needs to do to adapt and innovate to address them. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got two great guests on the program to help us make sense of things: Matthew Levitt and Douglas London. Matt is the Firmer Wexler Fellow and Director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He previously served in a variety of roles related to counterterrorism and financial intelligence with the State Department, Treasury Department, and FBI. Doug is a non-resident scholar at MEI, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies, and a retired 34-year veteran of the CIA's clandestine service. Matt, Doug, welcome to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure as well.
Matt, let's start with you. Nearly 2 decades on from the attacks of September 11, 2001, how would you assess U.S. counterterrorism posture and the threats facing the homeland broadly?
So those are two different questions. On the issue of the threats, they're more diffuse. There are a lot of threats to the homeland, both from international terrorist groups and domestic terrorist and violent extremist groups. The likelihood of big organized terrorist attacks like 9/11 has decreased, but you have many more groups in many more places. There are far more people who are radicalized to the point of wanting to carry out acts of violence today than there were at 9/11. We've made many steps forward in terms of making it more difficult for people to act on those beliefs. So we've done well in tactical counterterrorism, but we have not done very well in getting ahead of the radicalization curve or strategic counterterrorism. On the issue of the U.S. counterterrorism posture, the U.S. counterterrorism posture for 20 years has basically been forward defense. Leaving aside the actions we've done in the homeland to harden our borders and to enable Homeland Security and FBI to do their job, the 20-year idea has been take the fight to the adversary. And we've been very, very successful, built up an incredibly effective counterterrorism posture, counterterrorism interagency, but it's not sustainable. And at a time when there are so many things we need to deal with, not only in terms of great power competition, but also a global pandemic, global economy, climate, etc., we need to come up with a way to be able to deal with counterterrorism that is more financially sustainable and enables us to leverage our unique tools that have been developed primarily for counterterrorism for a broader, wider array of threats.
Doug, turning to the Middle East and North Africa region specifically, can you give us a sense of the landscape in early 2021? What are the most pressing CT challenges and areas of concern?
Well, the U.S. still has around 3,000 troops in Iraq and Syria addressing the needs of the coalition to fight the Islamic State. ISIS hasn't gone away. It's looking obviously to morph and try to operate more asymmetrically, but still it's made some demonstrations of some success, sadly, in areas it had lost, both across Iraq and Syria. Little under the radar somewhat is what's going on in Libya when we speak of North Africa. U.S. policy in the Middle East tends to rotate around Israel and Iran and the Gulf primarily. But we just had a recent formation of a unity government in Libya, which could suggest some hope on the horizon in terms of the terrorist threat coming from North Africa and south of Sahel. We'll see if this takes place, but Libya is another case where something Matt has written very eloquently about, where the CT issue also very much comes under the umbrella of great power competition with so many players involved. So it's an opportunity, I think, for the Biden administration to flex its partnership muscles, and it's trying to address things in a less transactional way and more in terms of multilateral issues around the globe.
Matt, to that point, how do you expect CT policy will change under the Biden administration? And what do we know from the recently released interim national security strategic guidance document?
Well, I think the big change is going to be in how we work with partners and allies. The Trump administration was very transactional, typically bilateral. And the Biden administration, not only since it came into office with its interim national Security Strategic Guidance issued in March 2021, but even in then candidate Biden's article in Foreign Affairs, Jake Sullivan's article in Foreign Affairs made it very clear that alliances were going to be critical. This idea that borderless threats demand collective action, that new types of power distribution around the world, both in terms of other great powers, near or regional powers like North Korea and Iran, increasingly powerful and transnational organized criminal groups, and of course, terrorist groups demand a new type of response, and that response is going to have to rely on alliances, and that for us to build those alliances, we're going to have to rebuild our credibility as a reliable partner. I think that when President Trump, not once or twice, but three times, woke up in the morning and tweeted out, "That's it, we're out of Syria," that had a real impact on our allies. I was in Europe, in a European capital, one of our closest allies, that first time that December when the president issued that tweet, and I can tell you, I saw it firsthand. They were really very shaken. The International Security Strategic Guidance touches on things like the need to address preventative issues, the need to address kind of global fragility issues, suggesting that this is not just going to be a question of how do we use our military and other types of force, but how do we leverage diplomacy? How do we leverage international aid? How do we leverage not only military, but more importantly, perhaps civilian counterterrorism capacity building?
Doug, what about from your side? What are your expectations from Biden team's early moves and the choice of key personnel like the new CIA director, Bill Burns?
I think the choice of Ambassador Burns reflects much of what Matt is speaking to in terms of the Biden administration's approach to doing things more in terms of coalitions and partners and less of this transactional sort of default to kinetic. The United States approach to counterterrorism, as Matt put it, has been preemptive, but it's been largely dealing with counterterrorism in a vacuum sort of separate from many of the multilateral issues that come to play. When you look at our situation in Afghanistan, for example, having sat in on many of those meetings in the past, the approach was, well, we need to address Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, but there was little appetite to address, let's say, the Pakistan-India conflict, and that is so influential in terms of how Pakistan views Afghanistan and its relations with us. So Ambassador Burns is well known for back-channel communications, obviously, with Iran and with the Libyans in the past. He's very focused. He has the ear and the trust of the president. And I think he brings in a bit of independence in being really an excellent and well-known consumer of intelligence, but he doesn't have some of the burden of maybe being involved in an intelligence agency in the past. So cautiously optimistic.
Matt, according to the interim National Security Strategic Guidance, the U.S. should right-size its military presence in the Middle East, quote, to the level required to disrupt international terrorist networks, deter Iranian aggression, and protect other vital U.S. interests, end quote. How feasible is that in the near term, in your view, and what would that look like compared to the current U.S. presence?
In a word, easy. In two words, not easy. The idea of right-sizing the U.S. military footprint is something that goes back now several administrations. I'm reminded under the Obama administration of the decision to pivot to Asia and to take some U.S. forces out of Africa and move them to the Pacific. Then Benghazi happened. And so at the end of the day, there are some in the U.S. military who refer to the 360-degree pivot to Asia, because at the end of the day, there were more forces in Africa than there were in the beginning. So everybody really across the political spectrum, there's great agreement in the idea of rationalizing our kinetic footprint, but how to do that so that you still have enough forces available, whether it's quick reaction forces, whether it's a question of basing, to be able to actually effectively disrupt international terrorist networks, to effectively deter Iranian aggression. That is a really complicated question. And the general idea is one that involves taking a step back from forward defense and relying on two things to fill the gap. One, is these partnerships with allies, asking them to step up more than they already have and to play a more pronounced role in their neighborhood and near abroad. So, kind of the way the French have led Operation Barkhane in the Sahel, with support from the United States, but not led from the United States. So, in other words, no longer a US led, partner enabled model, but flipping it on its head, a partner led, US enabled model. And the second key that people are thinking of relying on is increasing our indicators and warning so that we have better ability to kind of forewarn of emerging trends. Remember, for example, that Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for a very long time was thought of as a regional threat until suddenly there were AQAP plots targeting the US homeland. The same with Al Shabaab in Somalia. You'll recall that not long before ISIS took over a swath of territory the size of Great Britain, it was described by President Obama as the JV group of terrorism. So we do need to have really effective indicators and warning, but that puts tremendous pressure on the intelligence community at a time when moving forces out of, say, the Middle East, by definition, will affect your collection. It will affect your human collection. It will affect the number of drones you have, not only drones that are armed, but drones that are there for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance with sensors.
Doug, on the issue of Iran specifically, if the Biden administration can negotiate either the renewal or expansion of the 2015 nuclear deal, a sort of JCPOA 2.0, what effects do you think that will have on Iranian aligned and backed actors across the region?
I think it's a bit more complicated, as we're going to find out, in terms of re-engaging on the JCPOA or anything in terms of the power dynamics currently in Iran. If you use the reference to hardliners and moderates, which I'm not particularly a fan of, because I really don't believe there are any true moderates in the Iranian government per se, it's still right now the IRGC and their closest allies who are dictating, and if not exerting the greatest influence over Iranian policy and Iran's decision whether or not to re-engage the United States. The IRGC and its allies in Iran do better when there are tensions with the United States. When there are sanctions, when there are tensions, when there are difficulties, with tensions at a simmer, not necessarily a boil, the IRGC has greater power, influence, and financial resources. So it might be a bit more complicated to get to where we'd like to go on a JCPOA 2.0, and doing one which then entails not just the nuclear side of the coin, but Iran's relationship with proxies that we believe are a threat, that Iran considers a fabric of its national defense. So it'll be tricky, and I think part of it will be making sure we have a coalition. The problem is the very same people who would oppose the treaties or oppose renegotiation, like the IRGC, want Iran to become more insular and are not necessarily influenced by the economic consequences of other, let's say, Western powers or European or other economic powers using that as leverage against them.
Matt, given your background at Treasury, I did also want to touch on the issue of counter finance as well here. What do you see as the kind of main trends and challenges there, and how does that fit into this whole equation?
I think the most important thing to say is that while the counter threat finance toolkit is exciting and it is powerful, it is not a panacea. I feel like it's developed somehow a little bit too much sex appeal, and people expect too much of it. On its own, it's not going to be very effective. When used wisely in tandem with other tools, it can be very, very effective. So sanctions on Iran were an effective part of the toolkit that brought Iran to the negotiating table leading to the JCPOA. Counter-terror finance tools can be very effective in denying terrorists the ability to have the funds they need to do certain things. They can also be effective as a follow the money financial intelligence or FinInt tool, another stream of intelligence to help identify networks. One of the things that's going to be interesting moving forward in the current administration is watching if and how we continue to help other partners develop tools in this space. It's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, there's something about having unique capabilities. On the other hand, the more partners, trusted partners have these capabilities, the more good we can do. Balancing these tools against other I would describe as national security prerogatives, such as humanitarian activity, charitable support, is going to be important as well. In the years after 9/11, we largely successfully cracked down on abusive charity as a major means of terror financing, but it's come back as man-made and natural disasters have occurred, in particular the war in Syria. And so that's something that we're dealing with once again. And then finally, there are technological innovations. Several years ago, the big innovation was the ability for people to make all kinds of payments through their cell phones and payments. Nowadays, it's cryptocurrencies and generally the ability to access, move money from your laptop or your cell phone, effectively making something like an ISP address a new type of financial intelligence that can be really effective. So there's lots to do here. There's lots of opportunity here, but we shouldn't confuse this with the panacea that will fix the many problems we're facing.
Matt, also on the issue of money, but in a different way, in a recent paper that you wrote for the Washington Institute, you pointed to the importance of ensuring that CT has a dedicated, sustainable budget of its own, separate from, as you put it, the kinetic military budgets onto which they are currently grafted. Can you elaborate on that a little and explain why that's important?
Sure. Without losing our audience to the minutia of and bureaucraties of government budgeting, the bottom line is this. Over 20 years, the quickest, fastest, most effective way to get money to support the counterterrorism mission set was to attach it to the military and kinetic budgets that grew very, very quickly to support our soldiers overseas. That means that intelligence community budgets, in particular for counterterrorism, but these tools ultimately get used for other national security threats as well, were literally grafted onto military budgets. They were not standalone budgets. And so if we are now going to say, look, we're going to draw down our military footprint in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, or maybe even the tiny footprint in Syria, people need to understand that that does not mean that you can simply assume you're going to have the same, certainly not increased ability to collect intelligence when those military assets move, because the budgets will move with them too. So it's not the case that, well, we can just move those drones with weapons and keep the drones with sensors. We got to make sure to disentangle the budgets so that we can do that.
Doug, I want to turn next to the issue of threat forecasting and assessment. Over the past decade, a number of major developments in the MENA region, such as the rise of ISIS, caught the US by surprise. From an intelligence community perspective, what have we learned from that experience, and are we in better or worse shape now than we were before?
At the time, there was more attention being paid in the Syria-Iraq region on the Nusra front. Nusra came out from al-Qaeda and was seen to be the successor to al-Qaeda in the region, where what later became ISIS was part of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we had declared success against, I believe, a number of times. The issue really comes down to resources and how much resources you have on evolving threats and how much you have on what's right in front of you. What's right in front of you tends to win because of political pressures. We have to do something about this right now. It's in the press, there's attacks, there's whatever pressures on the government that then trickles itself down. And at the time of ISIS's ascension, we were focused on what we believed to be the strategic defeat of al-Qaeda in South Asia, predominantly Afghanistan and Pakistan, and looking at Nusra Front as more focused on Syria and less of a threat to the United States in terms of terrorist threat, and thus miss the ISIS node. Ambassador Burns in his confirmation hearing did speak to the issue, did speak in general, that is, to the idea of making sure that there are dedicated resources to keeping an eye out for what's coming up over the horizon and not losing that very critical part of intelligence, which is forecasting and putting things on the radar. It seems the ambassador is taking some of these lessons. We'll see how that plays out. But, in general, when we speak of intelligence, we make sure the point is made that it's not a crystal ball and it responds generally to tasking and requirements. So Some of this is also a top-down matter, and how this is going to be handled by the National Security Council, the National Intelligence Council, from which a lot of the tasking comes. And Ambassador Burns does bring a fair bit of experience from being a chief of mission, from being senior in the State Department, and having worked with the IC as well as the White House, which might hopefully allow for a little bit more balance to permit resources to look over the horizon while looking as well at the shiny object in front of us.
Matt, one of the major challenges facing the IC is the sheer volume of data being produced, which kind of only grows by the day. How can the intelligence community adapt, and what changes or innovations do you think are needed?
It's absolutely true. The data challenges are immense. Russ Travers, when he was the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center, currently working with the White House, described it this way, saying the data challenges we face are extraordinarily complex, particularly when we're dealing with information that is invariably incomplete, generally ambiguous, and often wrong. The amount of data is overwhelming. The National Counterterrorism Center deals with an average of 300 threats to U.S. embassies and consulates a year, handles more than 10,000 incoming terrorism-related reports a day. Those reports include some 16,000 names to be dealt with on a daily basis. And the amount of information is only going to increase if, in fact, we move away from a forward defense posture towards one that is reliant on indicators and warning. There's just going to be more information coming in. And so I think it is long past due for the U.S. intelligence community to get the kind of upfront investment necessary for hardware to support artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning. And if we're going to be doing forecasting in any kind of serious way, we're going to have to do that.
Doug, anything you'd like to add on that as well?
Well, there's a great deal of technology coming online. It's really how to use it and how to process it. There's always a concern in the IC that, and this stems to political pressures as well, you want to make sure whatever you've collected, you're able to process and do something about. We're collecting more and more reams of information, and we're trying to use quantum physics and AI and all sorts of ways to get through it, but we're heavily lending on machine technology to do that until we could sort of incorporate better discretion and judgment. What you don't want to have is information that you have not even processed yet, that speaks to threats or speaks to challenges, which then come to be before you've had an understanding to be able to deal with them. So the data exploitation piece is going to be huge, and it's going to be huge in terms of not just the technology, but how we wrap our arms around actually handling it and doing something with it on a practical basis.
Doug, on an operational level in Washington, what needs to be done to enable a more efficient and effective approach to CT? What are the kind of relevant bureaucratic hurdles in addition to the technological ones, and how can they better be addressed?
So in the national strategy paper and what the Biden White House had said, it's, in speaking to trying to better fit counterterrorism and great power competition and such, and to align it where it should be in terms of the resources, the blood and treasure that it takes up. A lot of this is going to come down to the devil in the details. So if we're going to extract ourselves from forever wars, but we still want to have intelligence collection from these conflict zones, if you remove the military infrastructure under which the intelligence is collected, there's going to be some problems. It's not just a matter of detangling the budgets, but the CIA, for example, in some cases exists in parts of Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq because of a military platform, which provides them a logistical hub, security, safety, and a means from which to operate outside the walls. If that goes away, there's not going to be a place for our intelligence collectors to operate from. So that's going to be an issue. In terms of trying to levy more of the responsibility on our partners, absolutely. And we do that very well. We've been doing that very well. And certainly the coalition against ISIS in Iraq and Syria has proven, I think, the formula works. But you can't just cut off the resources and try to move them elsewhere if you're talking about the need to provide capacity building to these partners. Resources, money, training, intelligence, and having military advisors or intelligence advisors, that's currency in the world for these partners. So there's going to have to be a political acceptance that money and aid and the presence of U.S. troops and certainly intelligence officers is not foreign assistance. It's not nation building. It's in order to effect that capacity building that we need in order to have our partners take on more of the responsibility. In terms of them leading or not, there's a risk there as well, because we can't just simply write them blank checks. As it is, some of the partners we deal with don't have the best records on human rights or democracy. That's going to be another sticking point politically as we talk about dealing with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, depending on how human rights records go with the Iraqis, who've done pretty well of late, but that could also change. And certainly what's going on in Syria and who are we dealing with on the ground in Syria? Where is our tolerance for that balance between dealing with governments or groups that we might not find live up to our greatest ideals of democracy, but it's a necessity for us to protect ourselves from terrorist groups or terrorists that might be inculcated from conditions on the ground, and they're the only game in town. So there's a lot of complex details and nuance here. I wish it was as easy as it is to kind of just say on paper some of these goals, but dealing with this in practicality and reality, and then, as Matt spoke to very well earlier, making sure we have the confidence of our partners so that they will take on these responsibilities, so that they will know we won't be fair weather friends, is going to require consistency, continuity, and the buy-in of the American people.
We're running short on time here, but before we wrap up, I do want to ask both of you for your outlook and what you see as the most concerning trend going forward. Let's start with you, Matt.
I think it's important to end with this kind of macro idea. Under the Trump administration, we had three big strategic ideas: the national defense strategy, the national security strategy, and the national strategy to combat terrorism, that were in sync on a lot of things and completely out of sync when it came to counterterrorism. The counterterrorism strategy talked about defeating terrorism, ending terrorism, and the national defense strategy in particular said that counterterrorism is no longer the primary national security threat facing the country. And I think that moving forward, we need to think this through. So the first thing I think is that we need to make sure that counterterrorism efforts are not seen in old Cold War binary terms of victory or defeat, but rather as an ongoing effort that is short of both war and peace, that would include both lethal and non-lethal tools to compete with adversaries and disrupt acts of terrorism. We need to explain to people in the public and on the Hill that asking the question, what's the exit strategy, doesn't apply to something like this. We're not going to end terrorism. We're not going to end crime. And the second thing is that we need politicians to do more, in particular, to build a sense of resilience among the American public. We as Americans have come to terms with the fact, for better or for worse, that there will be shootings. There will be accidents on our roads. You're still much more likely to get injured or killed in one of those than you are in an act of terrorism. But somehow terrorism has this outside effect, and we can make whatever types of decisions we want in the moment about rebalancing counterterrorism and great power competition, etc. But the second something actually happens, and we will never be able to stop all acts of terrorism, the second something happens, it is no longer a rational conversation. It's an emotional conversation. Anticipating that, we need to build resilience. At the end of the day, terrorism does not and never will present an existential threat.
Doug, how about you? Any final thoughts?
I certainly hope that as we look forward in terms of how we're going to realign ourselves in dealing with the terrorist threat across the globe, that we fundamentally start out with an understanding that terrorism doesn't come from within a vacuum. It comes from conditions on the ground, conditions that lead to grievances, that lead to victimization, that then turn to extremism and violence. And it is a very multifaceted world. Grievances can be stemming from the effects of climate change, the lack of water in a certain country, pandemics where certain countries are not getting vaccines. That all feed into the victimization of, for let's say, the Islamic world, what the West has done, what the United States has done, let's say. So there has to be, I think, a real commitment and more than just words to balance of soft power and hard power, to looking at conditions where the United States could use holistically all of its tools of power, economically, diplomatically, and from a leadership role as well, to address the conditions from which terrorism is going to grow. I believe in the past, again, this whole transactional approach to terrorism has often created, in sometimes, greater problems for us in terms of fracturing, decentralizing, spreading the terrorist threat around the world and making it so harder to root out. So it's really an opportunity, I think, for going forward, if we're talking on all these levels about multilateralism again, about using soft power more effectively in balance, that we're on the right path, but that right path, as Matt very well said, could be derailed with the first violent act, with especially, God forbid, a catastrophic act, which we've been able to avoid for those years. So I certainly concur with Matt's point on resiliency and commitment, but that's where the government does have an opportunity to secure buy-in from the public and try to take the better parts of transparency where it's helpful for us, for the American people, to see what they're getting for their money, what they're getting for the resources is in fact in their best interest when it comes to the CT fight.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Matt, Doug, thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.